Dobrodošli. Moje ime je Azra Hadžić. Ovo su priče koje izdvajamo. Godina je od početka rata u Gazi kojem se i dalje ne nazire kraj. Podsjećamo na događaje od 7. oktobra prošle godine. Koliko je 7. oktobar promijenio Izrael i kako na rat u Gazi gledaju Izraelci. Iz Tel Aviva govori nekadašnji izraelski diplomata Alon Pinkas. Istražno odjeljenje Al Jazire prikupilo materijal koji otkriva niz nezakonitih aktivnosti izraelskih snaga tokom rata protiv Gaze. Prošla je godina rata u Gazi, jednog od najsmrtonosnijih i najrazornijih u novijoj historiji. 7. oktobra Izrael je pokrenuo razornu ofanzivu na pojas nekoliko sati nakon što je palestinska grupa Hamas izvela do tada nezapamćeni napad na Izrael u kojem je ubijeno više od 1100 osoba, a oteto 250. U proteklih godinu izraelske snage ubile su više od 42.000 Palestinaca u Gazi, a ranile blizu 97.000. UN procjenjuje da je više od 10.000 osoba pod ruševinama. Podsjećamo na događaje od 7. oktobra prošle godine.
Opisuju ga kao najteže kršenje izraelske sigurnosti u historiji te zemlje. Palestinski borci iz Gaze izveli su iznenadni napad, koji je počeo ispaljivanjem 1000 raketa na teritoriju Izraela, za koje izraelska protuzračna odbrana nije bila spremna. Zatim su probili višestruko osigurane granice s kopna i iz zraka u masovnom napadu na južni Izrael.
ابدأوا بالزحف اليوم الآن وليس غدا نحو فلسطين ولا تجعلوا حدودا ولا أنظمة ولا قيودا تحرمكم شرف الجهاد والمشاركة في تحرير المسجد الأقصى.
Hiljade boraca Hamasovih brigada Al-Kasam i brigada Al-Quds palestinskog islamskog džihada zauzele su izraelske vojne baze i granične prijelaze pod kontrolom Izraela na periferiji Gaze. Napad je izazvao nevjericu širom svijeta, prvenstveno u zemlji poznatoj po sigurnosti.
אזרחי ישראל, אנחנו במלחמה, לא במבצע, לא בסבבים, במלחמה.
Hamas je operaciju nazvao poplava Al-Aqsa, ali za Izrael je to bio jedan od najmračnijih dana u historiji i postao je poznat kao masakr.
أنتم اليوم على موعد مع النصر العظيم والفتح المبين من على جبهة غزة العزة.
Procjenjuje se da je u napadima 7. oktobra ubijeno 1139 osoba. Otet je 251 Izraelac i stranac. Godinu kasnije gotovo 100 ih je i dalje u Gazi.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
Među najteže pogođenim područjima su gradovi i naselja blizu granice s Gazom, poput Kibuca, Beri, Kfara Za, Nahal Oz i Sderot. Najžešći napad izvršen je na muzički festival Nova u Kibucu Reim, gdje su ubijene 364 osobe. Međutim, najšokantniji propust 7. oktobra bio je zakašnjela reakcija izraelske vojske. Propust koji je doveo do nekoliko internih istraga o tome zašto su vojsci trebali sati da odgovori na najveći napad u izraelskoj historiji.
Bio je politički savjetnik Ehuda Baraka i Šimona Peresa, te generalni konzul Izraela u Njujorku. Piše tekstove za brojne svjetske medije. Alon Pinkas javio se za Al Jaziru iz Tel Aviva i govorio koliko je napad Hamasa 7. oktobra zaista promijenio Izrael, te kako Izraelci gledaju na proteklu godinu i rat u Gazi.
October 7, 2023, a year ago today, is considered by Israelis, you know, the average guy walking in the street up to and including a prime minister, is considered to be the worst day in Israel's history that became arguably perhaps the worst year in Israel's history. Both if you look at the statistics, but also if you look at the zeitgeist, the mindsets, how people feel. There's no question about it. You know, you can hit Hezbollah all you want, and you can indulge in a missile ping pong game with Iran, but the humiliation and the devastation of Hamas's attack on October 7th is indelible. This is a government that basically in its basic guidelines of December 2022 said that there will not be any negotiation with the Palestinians. Now, Israel had it, you know, a fool's ship, or a ship of fools, rather, thinking that we can ignore the Palestinian issue with Mr. Netanyahu inventing, devising, adopting, and expounding a policy of weakening the Palestinian Authority via strengthening the Hamas or preserving Hamas's power in Gaza. And in doing so, he can always have an excuse why there is no credible partner on the Palestinian side. Now, you can live in this denial for so long, and then came October 7th. At first, the idea was to eradicate Hamas. But I think there's a realization that is not easy to do. That's almost impossible to do. The only way conceivably to do that is a course of action that Israel will not take, and that is basically occupy the entire Gaza Strip and be responsible for the lives of the desolate lives of the poor people who are living there above and beyond those who are members of Hamas. Now, Hezbollah is a completely different thing. So when you said eradicate everyone that threatens Israel, yeah, you know, every country would love to do that, but that's mafia or mobster mentality. That's not how countries can and should be run. For the first few months, Israelis were rarely aware of what's going on in Gaza, other than finding out via the media that the army is attacking and the Air Force is bombing, and special units have operated, and a neighborhood was flattened, and an X amount of Hamas members were killed. But the scope of the devastation of Gaza, unless you watched Al Jazeera or BBC or CNN or any other foreign media outlets, was unfamiliar. Then came the "we don't care, look what they did to us" mentality. Look, it's very human. It's very natural. It's not right. You need to be aware of what's going on, because that will foment the next round of hostilities and violence, which, you know, we're not even thinking about the next one because we're still in the midst of the current one. And as the pictures came out or emanated from Gaza, people's feelings were basically hardened. They said, look, this, you know, people call this a war of revenge. Yeah, it's a war of revenge. Look what they did on October 7th. Look at the slaughter. Look at the barbarity. Look at the savagery. So yeah, we're doing the same thing. And you know what? Any other country would have done the same thing. So people started feeling, you know, this moral superiority, and we're entitled to do everything and anything. And to be honest, you know, with American support and American backing, the fact that the rest of the world was aggravated and annoyed and frustrated and accumulating criticism didn't seem to matter to most Israelis.
Tokom genocida u Gazi je ubijeno više od 16.800 djece. To je najveći broj ubijenih maloljetnika tokom jedne godine ikada zabilježen u nekom ratu u posljednja 2 desetljeća. Za djecu koja su preživjela, situacija je teška, jer ih je više od 19.000 izgubilo jednog ili oba roditelja. A ljekari iz Gaze govore da je čak 3.000 djece ostalo bez najmanje jednog ekstremiteta.
Plač djece odjekuje pojasom Gaze, dok svijet svjedoči ratu koji krši sva njihova prava.
قلت لما نفسي أكبر أطلع دكتورة أطلع مديرة أطلع عامتي. لقيت صرنا نتمنى في الموت. بطلنا نعيش زي ما بقينا بغزة نعيش حلوين. لقيت صرنا نتمنى الموت. حياتنا موت صارت هالقد.
Majsin život se promijenio do neprepoznatljivosti, jer je ostala slijepa u jednom izraelskom napadu. Kaže da je iscrpljena boreći se za opstanak svaki dan, jer Izrael bombama gađa cijelu generaciju. Izgladnjivanje i bolest. Više od 40% Palestinaca ubijenih u ovom ratu su djeca. Brojni su nestali, a pretpostavlja se da su hiljade mrtvih ispod ruševina razorenog pojasa. Palestinske majke primorane su ukopavati svoju djecu. Svakom djetetu u Gazi nešto je oduzeto. UNICEF je naziva najopasnijim mjestom za djecu na svijetu. A iz tih zločina nastao je novi akronim. Povrijeđeno dijete bez porodice, koji ukazuje na povrijeđenu ili osakaćenu djecu za cijeli život. Uz to i sasvim samu. Izrael je prisilno izložio palestinske maloljetnike većim traumama nego što će većina odraslih to ikada doživjeti. Bombama su gađali domove, bolnice, škole, uništavajući svaki mehanizam zaštite djece.
مرقنا جوا بالصف قلنا لما بس تبقى الاخت منزلينها براسها كلها ميته وصار اختي الصغيره مرميه على الارض هي ومحمود كله مستشهد وامي متصابه براسها كله مرمي على الارض قدام كله بفابل يا الله.
Mnoge palestinske porodice kažu da je međunarodna zajednica iznevjerila djecu Gaze, ostavivši ih same, okružene smrću, razaranjem i užasom. Bili su prisiljeni izdržati godinu dana koja je promijenila njihovu prošlost, sadašnjost i budućnost. Ali njihova nevinost dopušta nadi da živi na mjestu gdje je sve protiv njih.
Prema procjenama UN-a, blizu 90% od 2,3 miliona stanovnika Gaze je raseljeno. Pojedini čak 7 puta. Stotine hiljada palestinskih porodica okupljene su u šatorskim kampovima bez struje, tekuće vode ili toaleta. Glad i bolesti su raširene. Više od 75% infrastrukture je uništeno, a među njima i bolnice. Zdravstveni sistem je u kolapsu. Tokom protekle godine bolnice i medicinsko osoblje su bili direktna meta, a zalihe medicinskih potrepština uslijed blokade svedene su na minimum.
Nekoliko dana nakon početka izraelskog rata protiv Gaze, pogođena je velika bolnica u centru grada Gaze. Ministarstvo zdravstva saopštilo je tada da je poginulo 500 ljudi. Izraelska vojska negirala je ciljanje medicinske ustanove. Od tada, uprkos globalnoj osudi, nastavili su bombardovanje i opsadu bolnica širom pojasa, tvrdeći da Hamas djeluje u tunelima ispod zgrada, koristi ih za pokretanje napada i tamo drži zarobljenike. Ali nije postojao ni jedan dokaz koji bi podržao takve tvrdnje Izraela. U roku nekoliko mjeseci humanitarne organizacije upozoravale su na zdravstvenu katastrofu.
The health system in Gaza has been completely obliterated and the right to health has been decimated at every level. The attacks, the harassment, the killings of many of my own colleagues, the healthcare workers, the destructions of health facilities, and the destruction of humanitarian aid organizations continue to catapult to proportions yet to be fully quantified, if at all possible.
Nijedna bolnica u Gazi nije pošteđena, više od polovine je van funkcije, a ostale su samo djelimično funkcionalne, uz nedostatak osnovnih medicinskih potrepština i opreme. Rezultat. Ljekari su bili primorani raditi operacije bez anestezije, čak i amputacije. Prijevremeno rođene bebe umirale su u inkubatorima uslijed nedostatka struje i goriva za njihov rad. Povrijeđeni pacijenti umirali su čekajući liječenje. U roku nekoliko mjeseci od početka izraelskog rata u Gazi bolnice su pretrpjele ogromnu štetu i gubitke radne snage, a UN ih je nazvao zonom humanitarne katastrofe. Izraelska vojska direktno je napadala zdravstvene radnike. Gotovo 1000 ih je ubijeno u zračnim i kopnenim napadima. Human Rights Watch navodi da su stotine medicinara uhapšene, ispitivane i mučene. Međunarodni zakoni zahtijevaju zaštitu bolnica, medicinskog osoblja i vozila hitne pomoći u svakom trenutku. Izrael je optužen za namjerno blokiranje medicinske pomoći u Gazi. U martu je Međunarodni krivični sud naredio Izraelu da dozvoli humanitarnu pomoć. Ipak, samo 69 kamiona pomoći ušlo je u Gazu u avgustu, u poređenju sa 500 na dan prije sukoba. Izraelski jednogodišnji rat protiv Gaze devastirao je zdravstveni sektor. Prenaseljeni šatorski kampovi, bez sanitarnih čvorova, vode ili struje, plodno su tlo za zarazne bolesti, uključujući kožne bolesti, hepatitis, meningitis i koleru.
الزبالة هذه احنا تعبنا صارت معنا كبد وبائي صار معنا امراض انا اليوم عمري 21 سنة بدي اشوف حياتي صارت قبال الزبالة.
Prvi put u 25 godina dječja paraliza otkrivena je u Gazi, što je navelo Ujedinjene nacije da provedu kampanje vakcinacije. Stručnjaci upozoravaju da bi kolaps zdravstvenih usluga u Gazi mogao znatno povećati broj smrtnih slučajeva.
Desetljećima su izraelski dužnosnici pri opisivanju Palestinaca koristili dehumanizirajući jezik kako bi opravdali okupaciju. Od 7. oktobra 2023. riječi su postale oružje za legitimiziranje rata u Gazi.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם. ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
The war in Gaza has one of the lowest ratios of combatants to non-combatants casualties in the history of urban warfare. And you want to know where it's lowest in Gaza? It's lowest in Rafah.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved.
מדינה פלסטינית לא יכולה לקום כי אין דבר כזה עם פלסטיני.
אנחנו לא נאפשר אפילו הצהרה על מדינה פלסטינית, אפילו הצהרה על הקמת מדינה כזאת חס ושלום.
Aron Mate je istaknuti kanadski pisac i novinar poznat po svojim oštrim komentarima o širokom spektru političkih i društvenih pitanja. Istakao se kao strastveni zagovornik istine i pravde, sa posvećenošću u otkrivanju činjenica. Otvoreno se protivi cionističkoj politici i nepravdi koju Izrael nanosi palestinskom narodu. Za Al Jazeeru govori o borbi protiv duboko ukorijenjene propagande i cenzure proizraelskog lobija.
In the case of Israel's claim, which was totally parroted across the U.S. media, that Hamas committed mass sexual violence on October 7th, there just simply was no evidence at all. It's such an egregious case. And it follows in a pattern where whenever Israel wants to carry out some new atrocity, they always make some claim about the people they're trying to kill to justify it. And this is clearly what was going on here. We know that there were atrocities by Palestinian militants on October 7th. They're on camera. But Israel and its apologists were not content just to let that speak for itself. They fabricated claims about dozens of beheaded babies, about burned babies, and then about sexual violence. And the reason why I think they really pushed the sexual violence claim is because it's a very sensitive allegation. People don't want to be seen to be denying such a horrific crime. So when Israel said this, that this happened, everybody fell silent. And in fact, worse than that, major media outlets in the US went along with it. So for example, the New York Times published this really extensive article in late December purporting to show that Hamas carried out mass rapes. But if you look at it, there's no evidence whatsoever. There's no physical evidence. There's no forensic evidence. There isn't a single identified survivor of sexual violence by Hamas, dead or alive. Not one. And in fact, the one person who the New York Times suggested was a victim, her family turned around and said that the New York Times was lying, that basically they had used her death to put a claim that just made no sense because they had actually spoken to her right before she was killed on October 7th. And there's no way there would have been time for her to be sexually assaulted in such a horrific way. So this story has really fallen apart because all there were to push this forward were people claiming to be witnesses of sexual violence. But if you read their stories, they didn't add up. They were contradictory. So somebody would say one thing, but then in a different story, they would say something else. And they would make outlandish claims for which there was no evidence. So, for example, one of these alleged witnesses claimed that they saw 3 severed heads on October 7th. So if you're going to say, I witnessed 3 severed heads, the obvious question is, where are these heads? And the answer is they're nowhere because they were made up. And that's why there's no evidence to support that claim. So this is the basic kind of journalistic scrutiny that we did about these claims. And because we were in a very small group that did our jobs, we stood apart. And accordingly, the story has fallen apart. But it was used in a very cynical way because in the period that it was not challenged, Israel has used that claim to go ahead and carry out its actual atrocities. And still, you have people like Vice President Kamala Harris, who's now running for president. She still invokes that debunked claim to justify supporting Israel and all of its terrible atrocities. While meanwhile, the entire U.S. media also ignores the only documented perpetrator of sexual violence, which is the Israeli military. And they've been caught now in multiple cases committing sexual violence against Palestinians. That also gets completely ignored. I do think the narrative certainly is weakened. And for that, I credit the people who have taken to the streets around the world protesting these horrific crimes. And when you have that many people speaking out, it's very hard for media to completely ignore them. And here in the US, where I am, you had this unprecedented wave of protest on college campuses, young students carrying a lot of risk to go out there, put their bodies on the line to camp out on their campuses to protest the Israeli genocide. And so that has forced the media to give voice to the people who refuse to let these crimes by Israel be committed in their name. But still, the foundational narratives around Israel and Palestine still very much persist. There's still this myth that it's the Palestinians that have always rejected these generous Israeli peace offers, which are as mythical as are the Hamas rape allegations. And because these narratives are so foundational to the whole apparatus that allows Israeli violence and occupation to continue, it's going to be a long time, I think, before those narratives at least are debunked in corporate media. But people are taking up the task of informing themselves on their own because they recognize that you just can't trust the media anymore, that the media is not there to inform people, it's there to propagandize people. So people are doing their own research, people are going to alternative sources of media. And that to me is the biggest way in which the narrative is collapsing. I've been involved in this issue pretty much my whole life. I grew up Jewish. I went to a Jewish summer camp, Jewish Sunday school, and I've never seen so much outrage among the Jewish community against Israel. And certainly when it comes to the younger generation, I think Israel has completely lost the younger generation. The generation that I grew up in and people older than me did have an attachment to Israel. A lot of that came from the legacy of the Holocaust and this belief that the Jews needed their own state of their own to protect them from such horrors ever again. But in the process, they blinded themselves to the horrors that they were inflicting on the Palestinians to create that Jewish state and to preserve it. But now I think young people have woken up to the reality, and there is a real shift there. And it's very powerful to see the images coming out of all the protests. Groups like Jewish Voice for Peace on Capitol Hill, occupying the Capitol Rotunda, being arrested in Grand Central Station. It's very, very moving to see this. And you see it spanning generations. You have Holocaust survivors taking part in these protests. My father is a Holocaust survivor, barely survived Nazi occupation as an infant. And it spans generations, people of that generation to very young people. It's very, very moving. And it does inspire hope.
Pljačke, ubistva i razaranje cijelih četvrti samo su neki od postupaka izraelskih vojnika u pojasu Gazi. Istražno odjeljenje Al Jazire mjesecima je prikupljalo materijal koji otkriva niz nezakonitih aktivnosti izraelskih snaga. Ova dugotrajna istraga putem fotografija i video zapisa koje su sami izraelski vojnici objavili na internetu tokom jednogodišnjeg rata razotkriva potencijalne ratne zločine. Sve je objavljeno u filmu pod nazivom Investigating War Crimes in Gaza.
Snimci izraelskih vojnika u pojasu Gaze objavljeni na internetu. Istražni odjel Al Jazeera identifikovao je vojnike odgovorne za njih. Tokom napada na Gazu, izraelski vojnici objavili su hiljade fotografija i snimaka.
These videos don't show a professional army. They show an army that at times appears to almost completely lack any self-discipline.
Odjel je sastavio bazu podataka koju čini 2500 naloga na društvenim mrežama.
The things that are really shocking to me is the repeated posting of videos of detainee humiliation. Naked Palestinian detainees with headbands and zip ties on their arms being paraded around, insulted, mistreated in many cases. Really blatant violations of international law, and yet they keep being posted by the perpetrators. It's really astonishing.
Snimci prikazuju i smišljeno razaranje civilnih objekata, kao i potencijalno teže zločine, poput snajperista koji pucaju u trojicu nenaoružanih muškaraca.
Just because a civilian is walking in an area where combat is going on does not make them fair game. It's potentially a matter that the International Criminal Court would want to look at.
This is extraordinary. The fact that he's put this onto video, he's released this on YouTube, to me is kind of quite extraordinary, the degree of impunity.
Pravni stručnjaci kažu da će prikupljeni dokazi zanimati tužioce.
It is a treasure trove which you very seldom come across. So to have that is something which I think prosecutors will be licking their lips at.
Istražni odjel je kontaktirao izraelske zvaničnike i tražio komentar o onome što su otkrili. Odgovor nisu dobili.
Bio je ovo još jedan Al Jazeera Svijet. Hvala vam za pažnju, ostanite uz naš program.